Welcome to this ASPI webinar exploring how cyber defence alliances could create a stronger digital economy, a session we're incredibly grateful to have our partner Jacob supporting. I'm Fergus Hanson, one of the two research directors at ASPI, and it is my real pleasure to be moderating this very special guest panel. Our international guest today is General Keith Alexander, the former director of the US National Security Agency and Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and in his post-government life, founder of IronNet. Closer to home in the nation's capital, we have Abigail Bradshaw, head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and also from Canberra, Rachael Falk, CEO of the Cyber Cooperative Research Centre. The theme for today's panel comes at a very timely moment, with news this week of serious deepening of cybersecurity cooperation. Last Friday, we had the Quad leaders, no less, commit to begin new cooperation in cyberspace and pledge to work together to combat cyber threats, promote resilience, and secure our critical infrastructure. The Quad also released a set of principles to guide technology design, development, governance, and use. 2 weeks ago, we had the formation of AUKUS, a major component of which will be a sharp deepening of technological cooperation and partnership among the US, UK, and Australian governments. Today, we're going to look not just at what governments can do, we're going to discuss collective measures government, industry, and academia can take to combat cyber threats to the benefit of our digital security and the growth of our digital economy. We're going to start today with a few questions from me. I'm then going to open it up to our audience, to you. Please get your questions ready and submit them via the portal. And please do upvote the questions that you like the most, and I'll do my very best to get through as many as we can. So to begin, I wanted to ask each of our panel members in turn, it's been a really momentous few weeks in foreign policy. So I want to start by getting your views on the implications of the Quad and AUKUS announcements for joint cooperation in cybersecurity. And maybe we can start with our guest from overseas, General Alexander.
Thanks, Fergus. Thanks for that question. It's an honor to be here. And, that's a great question given the partnership that our nations already have in terms of working together. I spent 40 years in the military and in our intelligence community. And I will say that working with your teams there in Australia was absolutely superb. In cybersecurity, it's, I think, vital that nations work together. We're interconnected, we see attacks, and we're attacked oftentimes by the same adversary. Imagine if we could build, and we built, a radar picture for cyber that covered not only what impacts Australia, but what impacts other countries. And we could share in real time threats that are hitting our countries and protect from that. I think when you start thinking about the Quad and other things, that's the type of thing I would say as we move forward, that's where our partnership has to go. And what we're doing and what the Quad will do and what we can do in this area is share information and work together. And I was really impressed with some of the recent news about what our country is doing, what the UK, Australia, and our country is doing with the submarines and others. And I think this cyber is going to be hugely important for our future. It's the one area where adversaries can attack Australia and the United States without trying to cross the oceans. They can do it in cyber. And we have tremendous vulnerability. So getting out in front of that, I think, is hugely important.
Wonderful. Maybe, Gabi, I could turn to you, seeing as it must have been a very busy few weeks for you with all of these announcements. What does it mean for you?
Thanks, Fergus. Well, it's always super busy and exciting in the ACSC. I just want to acknowledge, first of all, in the spirit of the topic of today's discussion, great partners, and in particular, it's a great privilege to be speaking alongside General Alexander, who is a long-time partner previously through USCYBERCOM, and now, of course, in his important industry role as well. And Rachael Falk, of course, the CSCRC is an awesome partner with the ACSC, augmenting areas of mutual interest and benefit for Australians in particular. I would just reinforce everything. I just can't stop nodding at what General Alexander's already said. The only thing I think I could add to what he's already eloquently put is it's it was not a great surprise, I don't think. I think globally there's a realisation of the importance of those critical technologies, of the importance of cybersecurity. I think the significance for industry, if you like, to put a different slant on the question, is that it will provide a premium to those industry providers who are really into security by design and transparency, and that I think is super important to us in our business.
Thank you, Abby. Rachael, you're from a civil society lens, but a group that works closely with government. What's your view on this?
Look, thanks. I also echo Abby's sentiments. It's an absolute honour and privilege to be here with General Alexander, Abby and you doing this panel. So thank you very much for inviting me. Look, I think certainly with respect to AUKUS, it is predominantly obviously a military announcement. So I do expect a lot of capability build in the military area rather than in civil society. But there's no doubt for both AUKUS and the Quad, the spillover for research, particularly universities to be able to have a greater hand in certain types of research they may not have been able to do. There's already a lot of collaboration with the US and other partners, but it certainly would mean that they will hopefully be the beneficiaries of even greater research. And that hopefully will spill over to civil society and smaller organisations here being a party to either onshore manufacturing or capability build out, absolutely, when it comes to potentially nuclear capability, because we don't have that in this country. And to echo General Alexander's points and Abby's, look, where cyber is so different to every other domain, you know, we all have the same terrain, we all have the same cyber shores. Nobody's got a different terrain when it comes to battling cyber. We're all battling the same enemy because we all have the same attack surface. And it's the more we can share. I don't think I could ever say you can't share enough when it comes to cyber, both intelligence, both attack methods, and all sorts of chatter across civil society that goes on. So I don't think anyone would ever say that oversharing is a bad thing. So the more allies you have, the more partnerships, security partnerships, intelligence partnerships that are meaningful can only be a good thing for Australia and our security in the region.
Great, thank you, Rachael. So, Rachael, maybe just to turn to you, it's been suggested that addressing cyber threats is not something that global norms or diplomacy can solve quickly, and that government and largely the United States at this point in time should contemplate more offensive measures similar to the ones that were allegedly used to disrupt Islamic State and their networks. Do you think that there is more government should be doing like this to starve out the threat actors and break their business model?
Sure, thank you. I just want to say up front that when it comes particularly to ransomware, but other types of cyber, whilst there's absolutely a role to play with government only should have offensive capabilities. It's only government who you want to be using those capabilities. This is not a problem that is just government or military alone, and it shouldn't be regarded as this is all government's problem and we have nothing to do. Certainly, there are parallels with ISIL potentially and what offensive measures were done. And remember that offensive capability measures are never, and as both General and Abby will attest to, government never comes out and says, hey, we had a great offensive day yesterday. They don't make it known. But certainly the recent passing of legislation here, the surveillance in disruption bill, allowing for now lawful disruption is a step forward. So I definitely think it could be that government contemplates disrupting certainly threat actors offshore, and the Slade bill that was passed will help that. I just want to say, whilst there is a role for diplomacy and there is a role for diplomats and there is a role for attribution, and particularly multi-state attribution, which again, remember, is a government decision, not a civil society decision, with the greatest respect to DFAT and diplomats, it's a glacial-like movement. Diplomacy will only solve it in a very slow way. Unfortunately, cyber moves at network speed, and something that would have taken months to effect in the real world takes 45 minutes in cyber. So there's a role for diplomacy, but it is not the fast track, and attribution and calling out attribution is a necessary part, but this is a big jigsaw. So definitely disruption and offensive measures whilst never openly discussed, and I'll leave the others to answer that, is something I think, and they did, the US government, and I'd be interested in General Alexander's views, the US government did come out afterwards and started talking about how ISIL was very connected and how that they, things that might look like DDoS attacks and other things happened, and there's certainly a role for that. But I think offensive capabilities should always remain with the government, and that potentially maybe there's a role for a greater narrative around what could be done, or post-event what has been doing to governments do to disrupt. But certainly I think there's potentially more government can do, but it is also, there's a role for civil society to also improve their cybersecurity posture.
Thanks, Rachel. General, maybe I could turn to you. In 2014, you finished up a decade of service as director of the NSA. Now you're applying that experience to the defensive side of things. Drawing from these experiences, what for you is the hardest thing about defending the cyber realm, and can we ever get ahead of the curve on this?
I think the biggest problem that I faced in government, and that we face today, is governments, not just ours, but yours as well, can't see attacks on the private sector. Yet the government is responsible for defending the private sector. And so we have this anomaly. How are you going to defend that which you can't see? Incident response is not a defensive measure. That's after everything bad has happened. So you think about solar winds here. The government finds out about it after the fact. And now people push on the government and say, why didn't you know? And the answer is because the government doesn't have the authority nor the capability to see all the attacks on critical infrastructure. So that remains our biggest gap. One of the things that we set out to do with this company was, so how do you build a radar picture for cyber? Imagine instead of having this gap, we said, what if we work together? I do like what the administration is saying. We need a public-private partnership. That's part one. And two, we need I'll call it an event generator that shows events that are hitting companies at network speed. That can be anonymized, pushed up to the cloud, and create a radar picture so you can now see all the companies where these types of events are hitting them. I think with what Abby's running, if you had that for Australia, imagine the ability to now see, like you do in radar for air traffic control, you can now see different DNS attacks or different types of attacks. I won't go into all the names, but domain generation, all these different things that you would expect, recon. If we could see that, then the government could take on the role of responding to attacks as they're going on. Fergus, I think this is the key to our future. If we don't solve that, our nations are at risk in cyber. And I believe our adversaries will use cyber to hurt us and to get us to stop whatever actions diplomatically or otherwise we were taking on. And I think that's got to be done over the next few years. We're going to be tested. So that's the problem. We've got to fix that public-private partnership, create that radar picture, and train the public and private sector to work together.
Wonderful. Maybe, Abby, I could pivot over to you. You're in the ASD's the lead cyber agency in Australia. The ACSC within that has the role of improving cybersecurity. I'm curious what your radar picture looks like right now. But do you have in that role, what do you see the role for government in terms of protecting critical infrastructure and the ACSC's role in that? And I suppose your situational awareness in this radar concept as well. And I'm just wondering more broadly, how well would you say at the moment that government and industry are currently collaborating in cybersecurity per the general sort of remarks there?
Yeah, thanks, Fergus. I love the radar metaphor, and that it's a really simplistic way of summing up really one of the ACSC's core objectives, and that is to create a radar picture for Australia, a sort of early warning system. And to the General's point, and also Rachel's point, re-offensive, really you don't want to start with offensive. If you've got good defensive measures, you actually don't need to go to the offensive, resort to the offensive measures. First point I'd make about our radar is it's pretty clogged. It's pretty busy. There are lots of blips. But there are also heaps of blips that aren't featuring on our radar picture, which we know are out there, and that obstructs our capacity to understand patterns and really have the true richness of a proper early warning system. I'd say the threat against critical infrastructure is real. We have 2 recent case studies in Colonial Pipeline and JBS Meats, which indicate that the significance and the impact on society of an attack, but also the implications internationally, where an attack can start in one jurisdiction and very quickly impact others, as was the case with the JBS Meats ransomware attack. For us, last week or the week before, we issued our annual threat report. In that, we analysed that at least a quarter of those attacks which were reported relate to entities which we would regard as critical infrastructure. That's a scary statistic. It's more scary when we know that the instances of attacks are severely underreported. So if our role is to operate centrally as an early warning system, to create a picture of what's going on, to anticipate where the next area of attack might come from, it's vitally important that we respect the privacy of those networks, but at the same time, the answer is for more reporting into the ACSC. And that's why the solution that's proposed by the government through the Critical Infrastructure Systems of National Significance Bill mandates reporting of significant cyber incidents which are impacting those entities which are regarded as critical infrastructure. That enables us as the radar operator to draw and conclude patterns, remembering that we are in hand-to-hand combat with the bad guys every day. We know what they look like, probably because we've seen them before. We can establish patterns, and we have done, even on the picture that we have to date. In last year, attacks on hospitals in Victoria and old and aged care facilities, on financial institutions, and we draw those patterns together and use the full range of our intelligence capabilities to make assessments as to who might be next. So one report from an entity that's been impacted or has seen incongruous behaviour can actually protect thousands. And that's the ecosystem that we need to get to.
Thanks, Abby. Gentlemen, and maybe I could turn to you and perhaps Rachel, you might want to jump on this as well. Abby's mentioned the number of ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure. I know that's a big problem in the United States as well, as she referenced. But in that area, we're starting to see attackers working together. You know, one person might create the tools, another person, criminal group, might perform the entry. But you've talked about, you know, collective working together as the defenders. What are the barriers that you're seeing to the defenders working together to try and pull their efforts and solve this problem?
Well, I think the biggest one is education. We're talking about shifting the way we think about cyber. In the past and today, we talk about signatures, that which we know, and then we teach people to block that, to fix gaps, and to go with what we know. What the adversary does is they now look for gaps that you're not seeing, or create malware to get in, or phish. All those are things that go undetected by the current system. So when we talk about generating this and going after ransomware as a service, those that come in and do the initial phase, to get the second phase, to get the third phase, what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the flaws in our current approach to cyber by saying, I know how you're going to defend it. I will come over or get around it and penetrate. You'll either make a mistake and I get in, or somebody will click on an email they shouldn't, I'll get in, or I'll use this 0 day that you can't see and I'll get in. And they just test. So that's where, when I talk about making this event type capability, What you really want to do is say, something happened here. I'll call it event A. And other companies say, I have event A too, and have two of those automatically communicate and say, we both have an event. We're seeing these things go on. That's the kind of solution that we have to be thinking of. And then that's got to be shared with Abby in this case, so that Abby can see that and help defend. And your nation can determine, do they want to use offensive tools to stop it? We have to attribute who's doing it and make them pay a price. Right now, the ransomware guys and Russia predominantly get off pretty much free. There is very limited downside for them. You know, we call out our evil, we call out dark side, we call out. Imagine if we indicted and put their picture up and said, that's the guy, and if we can, we will arrest you. You can't move out of Russia. You're going to have to stay there for the rest of your life. We got you. We know who you are. You know, I think we've got to do all of that. As I look at that, it's attribution, it's working together. I see companies, actually, we had this discussion. We have 90 mid-sized banks as an example. Each of those banks have 10 people that are working on this problem, doing the best they can. Now imagine if those 10 people were able to work with the 10 people there and the 10 people there, and they could share these events, share knowledge, and crowdsource. You now have 900 people working together to defend that set of banks. Which is better, 10 people working on your bank or 900 people working together? So collective defense with the right tools, knowledge sharing and crowdsourcing is the future. We don't have enough people to do this. So we've got to bring that kind of approach together. And if you think about it, that's how our countries were made. We don't have every city defending itself, every state defending itself. We have our country working together for collective defense. We need to do that in cyber in a very serious way.
Rachel, do you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. I think partly what General Alexander said, I think there's also an issue of companies, big and small, whilst certainly larger companies have the resources to defend themselves and critical infrastructure, to the most part, financial institutions do it well, but I would not say that every big organisation, listed or not, critical infrastructure or not, has this sorted out. There are varying reasons why there's not as much collaboration as the General said. It would be great if we could all collaborate. There are informal collaborations. Some of it is we've got great systems. It won't happen to us. We've set our 18 controls and they're fine. As General Alexander said, this is a dynamic environment. The cyber criminals have always had the advantage there. They've always worked from home. COVID was no problem for them. It was a problem for us, but it certainly wasn't a problem for them. And I also think in Australia, we're about to introduce sort of more mandatory reporting. And I think in the ACSC report, they had 500 ransomware attacks that have been reported. It's a massively underreported crime. We know that. So it means that basically organisations can either choose their own private incident responders, which is fine. They don't have to communicate with the ACSC, but it also allows them to create their own narrative, rightly or wrongly, which may not be quite right. Often companies will want to manage it and not want to talk about it. They won't want to necessarily go public. I was heartened to see that in the US with the Coursera breach ransomware attack, their CEO did go on Good Morning America. The more we can have CEOs come out publicly and talk about it, so it's not something to be ashamed of. Sure, there's this element of what I'll call negligent victim, where they probably could have done a lot more, and in fact their own behaviour sometimes led to the vulnerability being exploited. That's not always the case, but even so, getting them coming out and talking about it, and even if it's a quick couple of minute grab on Good Morning America, it helps uplift the security of others when they simply have messages like, go and get a security audit, have multi-factor authentication, and just do a few things that make your organisation safer. Because to the General's point, certainly the cyber criminals will look for flaws, well-known flaws, which the easiest way often to get in is an email and a lure, but they'll also steal credentials, that the sophisticated ones will sit on networks for months and months and then know what to tie up. And in some cases, in the very bad cases, like a NotPetya, it could be a 0 day. But importantly, the world is replete with examples. So even organisations don't need to be talking to each other. The world delivers up examples every day of what is happening. And that is something where, to the General's point of the ACSC, if you work with the ACSC, if we get good radar, we get a good picture, but we also know that you're not immune and your cyber defences will constantly need to be honed. So it's something where collaboration is key. You would always want to be talking to the ACSC. Companies should join up and be partners, but be that as it may, it's not a set and forget. It's not we've done these controls and we'll look at them in a year's time. It is constantly evolving, and it's challenging for small business, but it's something that constantly evolves. I always say to people, you wouldn't leave your physical assets undefended. You wouldn't simply leave your bank details out in the open. You have to treat your digital assets with exactly the same level of protection as you would every other valuable asset in your organisation, and protect them fiercely. The problem is with this one, there are lots of ways to get into your organisation, but even with the right controls and the right controls for small and large businesses, you have to just make it harder so they move on to the next target.
Great, thank you. Abby, maybe I could turn to you. You've worked obviously in classified environments that have access to lots of sensitive sources, but you also play this very important role between the classified world and the declassification of that information to get it out to industry so you can help them defend themselves. How do you best play a bridging role and share that information with companies that could use it to protect themselves?
Thanks, Fergus. So I would say on the positive side, in terms of our engagement with industry, whilst there is clearly vastly more that we can do in order to really optimise that engagement and that sharing of information, we've had really positive trends within Australia on that front. Last year at mid-year, we had about 360 partners, that is ACS, that is industry entities who wanted to partner with the ACSC to take advantage of our free service, which is the passage of indicators of compromise or alerts pushed out to those partners. This year, we introduced 3 levels of partnership: a network partnership for those entities that have large networks, that have CISOs that want to be our partners, business partners, so you might not be in IT, you might be a medium-sized entity that just wants to know what's going on, and home partners, so that's any individual. We've increased our partnership by 130%. We now have thousands of network partners and thousands of business partners and tens of thousands of home partners. That is an awesome ecosystem which operates both ways. It enables us to be in a position where, for example, in the instance of the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, we were able to, within hours, hit a whole bunch of those partners with advice about how quickly they needed to take Microsoft's excellent advice about not only patching, but running scripts to ensure that malicious actors weren't inside their systems. We ran a scanning capability to determine how many users had actually closed the faulty locks, if you like, or closed the doors that had been wedged open. And we saw a dramatic reduction in that by tens of thousands of potentially impacted people. That's a really positive example about how we can work seamlessly and without actually touching or looking at anyone's private system, but by giving them the tools and the early alert system to help themselves. That's the position that we want to be in going forward. And just to add to the importance of that from an operational perspective, one of the key findings from our threat report in the last 2 weeks is that over the last 12 months, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the time between which vulnerabilities emerge and are disclosed publicly, and the time frame within which they are prosecuted by malicious actors. So in the past, we used to say, well, you need to patch maybe weekly or monthly. what we've seen now is that there are malicious actors clearly sitting, constantly searching for, and there's thousands of these, tens of thousands of these operating for state-based actors or criminal syndicates, sitting, watching, waiting for the first advice about a vulnerability in a system, and then within hours selling that, propagating that so that it can be prosecuted. We saw this happen in the instances of Microsoft Exchange, Citrix and Mobile Iron. So, and that's the importance of having that rich picture that General Alexander's talked about, so that we can get ahead of those that army of actors looking for those vulnerabilities to prosecute.
Abby, maybe I can just ask one quick chaser on that one and around this, the threat intelligence information that you're getting. I think you mentioned previously that it's a big part, there's a lot of stuff happening. Is that useful to you on a day-to-day basis, or is it something that requires a huge amount of effort to understand and interpret and make sense of? Is it, just what are you actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and is it useful in a tactical sense?
Every piece of information is useful. It all adds to a broad picture, and we have experts sitting there analysing, hundreds of analysts trying to work out what's the pattern in that. All of the sources are of interest to us. They are one call every 8 minutes to our 1300 cyber hotline. They are round-the-sun cooperation with our Five Eye partners, so our analysts are working literally 24/7. They are our incident responders, taking the email reports or the cyber reports and analysing those to develop pictures. They are even, each morning, us going through the media articles, looking for the reports which aren't provided to us so that we can reach out and say, hey, can you tell us a little bit more about that? What my guys are absolutely brilliant at is fusing all of those sources and very quickly declassifying anything which would impact our intelligence equities and turning that into practicable information that can be actioned immediately.
Wonderful. General, I was wondering if I could ask you a sort of follow-up on that. You've obviously worked with a lot of that traditional threat intelligence information as well. Do you see limitations to that, or are there other forms of information that can be used to supplement that in this sort of idea that you've got of a radar map and responding collectively?
So I think there's, from my perspective, multiple uses of threat intelligence. One, as Abby said, this is how you help people understand the threats, what's going on, and what you get out front. That's probably the most important. Another one is when you build an expert system, you get in so many events that people can't look at all of them. So you want to build it in so threat information can go into the expert system and automatically rank order all the events and say, you need to look at these because you told me if all these things occurred and all these events occurred. And that can do that through different types of threat feeds and threat information. I think that's a valuable way of propagating to a radar picture the events that you should be looking at. We're seeing you told me if an A occurred and a B occurred, do this. So I think that's the type of machine learning and AI that will be part of the future and will leverage that same expert system. It's interesting, as humans, we have a few, things that we can do things good on a set of levels. If you think of n-dimensional arrays, that's very difficult for us to conceptually start to say, okay, I can process these events, but I can't process all of these events as a machine could. So I'm going to have the machine do that, use that threat intel to help navigate what's going on, and actually have the output give input to others that is now useful intelligence and information on what's going on. So I think to answer your question, I think there is a path forward that shows how this will be extremely useful in the future, and it will drive us to get really concrete types of information to evaluate the types of events that are going on in our network so we can quickly discern problem or not problem.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn very shortly to our participant questions that are streaming in. So please, if you've got a question, please get it in and please upvote the questions that you like the most. Rachel, I just sort of finish with you, if that's okay.
Sure.
I was wondering, what's your views on, we've got different organisations at different cyber defence maturity levels. What's the prospects for them collaborating together and working together, as even though they're at very different cybersecurity maturity levels?
Look, I think it's all possible, but what you arguably want is and this is a critical issue for supply chain, and why it matters in your supply chain if you have vendors that don't rise to a particular cybersecurity level. Ultimately, you want everyone to have minimum standards of cybersecurity, so that when you share information with them as a business, you're sharing information you know will be protected. We actually have a legislative overlay here in Australia by way of the Privacy Act, which means that if you have particular sensitive information or information that has to be protected in accordance with the Privacy Act, which most data does, then they have to also operate at the same level. So collaboration is also part of the lifeblood of the digital economy. And realistically these days, and when I was at Telstra, many years ago, one of the first jobs I had was to have a team where we had a cybersecurity posture and minimum standards that we were making sure the thousands of vendors were complying with. So it's really important. You can work at different levels, but ultimately will come down to a trust situation. And if you need to trust and share data and you can't be assured that it's going to be shared in the same way, well, ultimately it's a bit like COVID and vaccines. You have the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. It's a bit of a two-track world. And after a while, you'll tend to go with the partners who can be trusted, because you know that they're going to protect information, they're going to be less likely to be a subject of an attack in the supply chain. So whilst it's possible, my ideal world would be that people are partners with the ACSC, people also know what they need to do, and that at least they're on the pathway to good and what better looks like for their organisation. Because it is a bit of a journey, and it can be one that takes time and effort, but that they're on that pathway, which is really important for them and for the whole of the economy.
Wonderful. We're going to turn to the questions that are coming in, and Nathalie Blakely has won the most upvoted question, and I think it may be best directed at you, Abby, if that's okay. The question is, what do we know about the cyber elements of AUKUS, and what differences will it make for Australian cyber operations?
Thanks. Well, I think the AUKUS announcement's most significant element at the moment is the collaboration on nuclear submarines, and that's obviously the number one initiative that the nations are pursuing, and we will get to the other elements, which include cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum, and undersea capabilities. What it means at a sort of public-facing, unclassified level is because many might ask, well, what more would you want? It's about being collectively greater than the sum of our parts. So establishing particular focus areas of priority that are common to, and the interests of all nations are shared, and really burden sharing the work so that there's less duplication on that particular issue, and a greater pooling of focus on a particular cyber issue. It could be an adversary, it could be a capability, it could be a particular operation. Great,
thank you. Abby, I've got the next most voted question is also seems to be headed to you too. The event type capability is an excellent idea. However, organisational capabilities to detect in the first instance and then share at machine speed are broadly immature here. How are the ACSC thinking about enabling technical capabilities that can be employed across industry to enable sharing?
It's a great question. We're kind of platform agnostic. We love information. We love automated information. And the solution that General Keith's spoken about is a magnificent example. We certainly engage with industry on what options are available. We're engaging with another company that's got a model that's working in the United States in the energy sector at the moment. Through that Five Eye collaboration, that enables us to study that capability within the ACSC and then consider whether or not it might work within the communities. I think what we've worked out through our engagement through our partnership program is that not all solutions will fit every community. And there are actually already well-established communities within the sectors. So if you look at the banking sector, for example, we've had a long time relationship with, in particular, the big banks, and they have their own method of exchanging between CISOs what they're seeing. And that's fairly immature and not as sophisticated as the sort of event type management that General Keith's talking about. But to his point about sheer volume, we can't continue to use shared signal groups or WhatsApp groups to exchange our information on what we're seeing. The movement to those sorts of technologies, like General Keith's talking about, is inevitable. The question is which one best suits the sector, and then how do we as the ACSC tap into that in a way that the communities are happy with in terms of preserving their own anonymity, but giving us useful information and a way to actually go into those communities to obtain more information in the event we need them. And I think that's very much the way of the future.
Did you want to jump in there, General?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the AUKUS agreements, the nuclear submarines, and then as Abby said, the cyber, the machine learning, the AI, the commitment to work together between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States is absolutely vital. It's our heritage. It's something that we've done. And now we can see all these events going on against our countries. We need to work together. And I think working together, we can help solve the problem. No one nation can do it by itself. So I think this is a great partnership. We see, you go back, first time I went to Australia, well, not first time, but many years ago, the Rio Tinto mines, and you go all the way forward, all the attacks that are going on there, here in Europe, the theft of intellectual property. This is something that we need to collectively get out in front of. And the recent 2 July talk by Xi Jinping was a gauntlet being laid down that said there would be bloodshed and bashing of heads. And he's talking about if you don't keep pushing back on the South China Sea or Taiwan or all the things, there's no limit to where they will go. So I think we have to set that red line, and we have to work together to do it. So I think this partnership is absolutely the right thing to do.
Great, thank you for that. Rachael, Kylie has a question for you. She says, you said only government should have offensive capability. Should that include government outsourcing to sovereign industry to get the job done?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure if they mean get the job done by maybe creating a capability, but absolutely, my view is that that only government should have offensive capability because only they know how and when it should be used, because as I've said publicly on the record before, it is government who attributes. It's usually the signals intelligence agencies that attribute. Attribution is a long, and as I can see General nodding and Abby will be nodding too, that is not something that we would want to put in the hands of private industry, no matter how capable they are, because they simply would not have. And I know Dmitry Alperovich and others would challenge me on this, but it really is something that you only want governments firing those kind of offensive capabilities at. There's no reason why there is absolutely, though, outstanding capability within industry to create all sorts of tools, and that should continue to be the focus, that the tools, the creation of tools, and it's known that the creation of tools are created out in industry, and then they have the establishment of InQtel and others that source great minds from industry and academia and bring them together for the use of intelligence agencies. So there's, to Kylie's point, there's no reason why fantastic tools and the brilliant minds we have out in industry can't continue to create and collaborate with agencies, brilliant tools. But my view is that those tools should only ever be used by those agencies, and we would not I'm not a supporter of having offensive capability in the hands of anyone other than government agencies.
Fergus, could I might just jump in there too, and just a couple of observations. The first is that you're talking about offensive capabilities in a context where people are conducting their lives online. You know, we don't want to create the wild, wild west out there. The second point I'd make is we take the exercise of those offensive powers incredibly seriously, as do our counterparts. They're not something that we exercise without proper due thought about proportionality, about collateral impact, about appropriate targeting. And they're not things that we exercise without really close and appropriate oversight by independent entities like in Australia, the IGES. I just make those points.
Thanks, Abby. We've got a question here that is sort of a bit future casting, and it's from Lewis about quantum computing. And Lewis has asked, how will the cyber landscape change when quantum computing becomes a more available option in both defensive and offensive actions by whoever has the capability? I'll leave it, if anyone wants to raise their hand on this one.
So I can talk a little bit about quantum computing. That's part of my background in physics. So, I think the good part, we can get into the technical details of quantum computing. But I think to answer the question, the first and perhaps the biggest issue for quantum computing will be your crypto systems. How good are they going to be? Not just for governments, but for all our transactions. Quantum computer makes cryptology a whole new ballgame. So we have to come out with quantum resistant computer algorithms and encryption algorithms that can actually withstand those types of brute force attacks. That's perhaps the first and most important. The second part is a much more difficult one to answer. If you think about the impact of computers as we have them today, how that changed the world as we know it from the mid-'80s to where we are today, quantum computing will have a similar impact on our future. And so that quantum economy is going to emerge out of quantum computing. And it will go from everything starting out with the big lanky computers with quantum all the way down to the future things that are very important for computing of the future. So I think it's a wave. It's something that we're going to have to embrace, but we need to understand both the gaps and the crises it's going to create. All of a sudden, imagine if all your banking information was cryptologically no longer good, and a sophisticated adversary could now just penetrate, wipe out your account and leave. Okay, that's a bad thing. Unless you're in the military like I was and you don't have any money, then you don't have to worry about that. But if that was a joke, I'll go slower, Fergus. So I think those are the things that we have to get our head around in quantum computing and where it goes. I think overall it'll be good. It'll help us in healthcare and all these other things.
Apologize, General. I was multitasking reading questions, so bit slow off the mark there. We've got a question from Mike, and he says, it seems that one of the concerns regarding mandatory reporting is the difficulty in doing so and keeping up. Would implementation of a capability like an IronNet with sharing, is that going to solve this problem of automated reporting that's needed, or is there some other, is it a suite of solutions that are needed here to get allow this automated reporting and radar picture to build up? I guess that's to you, General.
I do think that's part of the solution. Rather than having to find and then report, have the system automatically generate the report, anonymize it, protect your intellectual property, but throw it out there and say, this event is going on. You're already telling people. And if it associates with bad stuff, you're already taking action while others can too. And everybody knows you've done that. I think we've got to get into that capability in that realm. That's kind of what we're trying to do. So as we look at all these different areas like the NIST framework, ISO 27001, all these different things, Imagine if instead we just implement these technologies and it shows that you're already meeting those standards. Then you don't have to go through a lengthy paper process to prove that the operational process that you're using is fundamentally sound. So I think we've got to figure out how to get there and make it easy. Rachael brought up a key issue earlier on. Small companies don't have the resources nor the people to do this. So we've got to figure out how to help do that for them, working with the larger companies and as part of that ecosystem. And that all comes together in just what this question is answered. If we can automate that process, we can take that burden off. They're already covered. You know, wouldn't it be nice to say it's covered? You know, you think, well, do you have this done? It's covered. How about this? It's covered. You're covered. That's where we need to get to.
We've got a question here from still Garian, and for the general's background context, he's a local journalist here in this space, and has a reputation for asking some pointed and tricky questions. But I think it's a really good one because it gets us to this solution part here. So he asks, the need for cyber cooperation, partnerships, information sharing has been cited in every conference since cyber was all in Roman numerals. If everyone agrees that it's a good thing, why doesn't it just happen instead of all the talk? What are the blocks? How do we remove them? Maybe I could just ask each of the panel members. Let's start with you, General.
Yeah, I'll start, and then Abby. And I think this is one where the back and forth with what Abby is saying and Rachael. When you think about it, the real key issue is, what are we talking about sharing? And if you're talking about sharing events as we know them today that you're blocking, then that sharing is almost useless because you're blocking it. So you have this signature and it's part of your Saracata rules, your rule set. And I tell you A is happening, you say, well, I already got that block. Why are you telling me that? Rather, what we have to do is say, okay, you have a rule set. Now what we're going to share is all the things you don't know. Well, somebody say, well, I can't share what I don't know. And so that's the jump to what I'm talking about in terms of sharing, where we need to be. Because what you don't know is somebody who penetrated your network, who phished you or did something. How do you do that? That's the process of using true behavioral analytics, an expert system with machine learning, anonymize that, sharing that anonymized data in the cloud, and then correlating that across all the companies and government agencies so you can see what you should be seeing of what's going on with the adversary. So that, I think, is the real problem that we have with sharing. People share what they know. The fundamental flaw in that is normally by the time they find out they know it. Think about SolarWinds. That was 9 months. That's not good enough. 18,000 companies. So sharing in front of that is what we have to do. And that has to be between the public and private sector and all those. And, you know, the ACSC and others are going to run that capability for Australia. They're the ones that see that. And that's the kind of technology that they need to have.
If I can just step in, thanks still, Garian, for the question. Always hits us where we need to be hit, but it's a really good question. I totally agree. I think there's, and to the General's point, I hear we should share more, government should share more, government should share. What does it actually mean? And it is the who, what, when, where, why, which to the General's point can take weeks, if not months. And the other reason is, what do we want people to share? My view is, and I agree with the sonar picture, I think that's great. And my view is root cause is key. Often, if you know how something happened, I'm less interested in who was getting it at someone. I want to know how they got in, how long it took them, and what they stole. Because then that can build up a threat picture from an industry perspective. Because if I know root cause and I know that they got through stolen credentials, so is there anything my organisation needs to be doing to make sure our credentials are not stolen? Well, that then leads to pragmatic guidance around either not sharing of passwords, not having them on a post-it note. So there's lots of practical things, but I think we have to break it down and say, when we say information sharing, what are the most useful bits that large businesses and small businesses need to know about exploits and about recent cases and ransomware exploits particularly, so that they can make sure it doesn't happen to them. And to the General's point, having been involved in breaches myself on the industry side, the problem is you're scrambling just to work out and to stop the flood. You're scrambling to stop the exploit from happening. You're trying to get incident responders in, even in pre-COVID. You're trying to get incident responders to physically be somewhere wherever you need. So you're just trying to get the incident managed, let alone thinking about what you need to share with government agencies or regulators. And that in itself can be, if you've got a very large attack surface and you operate a really large organisation, that can even be a huge challenge. So in the heat of the moment, and when you're trying to manage, the last thing you're thinking about sharing is what you need to share. But I'm sure we're all conscious we need to share something and you need to communicate with the ACSC. But for me personally, having been across in large industry, but also operating a small business, the most helpful things over the last sort of few years for me is when I've spoken to CEOs of smaller organisations, one of the first things I say is, do you know how it happened? And they go, yes, we do. Stolen credentials. And from that, we learnt this, this, and this. And the message to everyone is multi-factor authentication. It was really helpful. Lived experience is the best information sharing. And even when you saw the House report, the Senate House report in the US on the Equifax breach, the way they methodically then go through what happened, how it happened, what could be done to improve that so it doesn't happen again. They're powerful things to share. But I absolutely think we get stuck in this fog of government has to share more, doesn't help anyone. I think what we have to remember, we're sharing so we can understand the etymology of a breach. So we as organisations and individuals know how to plug that hole. That's why we're sharing. I love the sonar picture. I love the General's point. I'd love that. And even for small business. But even lived experiences, so that we published a ransomware paper with ASPI recently, my centre and ASPI. And one of the things we did ask is that there be mandatory reporting of all ransomware breaches, but also that organisations can't just report that they've been breached. They also, when they, as best they can, have to report out root cause. So root cause is also reported and then publicly without anonymised. But then the public then finds out in a timely fashion what the root cause was and how that happened. That's the part. Information sharing for information sharing's sake helps no one. And I think that's what Stilgaren was trying to lead the witness on. It absolutely helps no one. The government can have then caches of data filled up everywhere. That gets no one anywhere. What helps is root cause in a timely fashion, published quickly. That really helps, I think, in my view.
Abby, did you want to jump in on this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think both General Keith and Rachel have covered it off from sort of different perspectives. My own lived day-to-day experience about why people don't share is, one, perhaps they don't know the importance of doing that. Two, because they perceive, there are different types of actors. State-based actors are quiet as they can be. They're not noisy. They might be observed as something which looks different, but there might be an entity doesn't necessarily, they're busy carrying out their business. They don't want to report what looks like an anomaly if to them there's no impact because they haven't, seen any disruption per se. Whereas criminal syndicates are very noisy and disruptive. That's part of obtaining a financial advantage. So perhaps there's a misunderstanding about the damage that's caused by that behaviour. Thirdly, to the point that Rachel made before, perhaps there's a commercial stigma or reputational stigma about reporting and alerting the public and therefore shareholders about a weakness. And lastly, there are regularly legal views, and that's not to say anything bad about lawyers. I started my life as a lawyer, Rachel as well. Lawyers are good people. They're just as good as people, doctors of physics. We've all got a role to play, but frankly, they get in the way. And what we've tried to make really clear in the context of information sharing with the ACSC is that when you share with the ACSC the stuff that Rachel's talking about, what happened, how do you think they got in? And if you can't work that out, share with us some of your system information you know, your logging details so we can help you how they found out. At the most simple level, that, as Rachael said, gets us to both cause and motivation. And that is the richness that we can then pass on to the next potential victims, right? So we've made it super, super clear that the ACSC is not a regulator. I think one of the best parts about the CISON's, the Critical Infrastructure Bill and its architecture is that there's a clear separation between the regulator and the ACSC in its cyber assistance and response function. And the consequence of that is companies should feel more comfortable with the fact that if you report to us, we do not share it with the regulator. You will not suffer any repercussions commercially or from a regulator perspective because you have shared with us. And we guard fiercely the anonymity of that reporting, both its source and where it's come from. The consequence of that is I become very boring in media interviews because I refuse to talk about the juiciest case that's come along. And apologies to all journalists, but it's something that I will continue to defend.
Wonderful. Well, we've come up to the hour. We've had an absolute with dozens and dozens of questions that have come in. I've done my very best to be democratic with choosing the most upvoted questions. But as with all democracies, populism is not always the best questions, and we've got lots and lots of great questions that didn't get asked. So I apologize to all of those who I didn't quite get to, but it's a sign of a great panel when you have many more questions than can possibly be fielded. So thank you for all the engagement from all the people listening in, and especially thank you to our speakers who generously gave their time to join us today. General Alexander, Abby, Rachael, thank you very, very much for your time. And thank you so much to the audience for engaging with us this morning.
Thank you, Fergus. Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Rachael. Good seeing both of you.
Thank you, General. Thanks, Abby. Bye-bye.